All right, friends, welcome one and all. It is good to see everyone and know that a lot of people are here. My name is Sam Heath, and I work with Equal Justice USA, and I'm the manager of our Evangelical Network. And this is our In the Movement webinar series, where we talk with people in the justice movement to engage and elevate different people's work that is happening across the country. And often I get to meet with people and talk about great things. It's not often that I get to meet with such close colleagues and friends. So Will Simpson and Mona Cadena are coming today to chat with us about all the things related to community. And so they have a lot to share. I have a lot I want to ask, have a lot I expect to learn. So thank you both for coming. Let me kind of set the stage before we begin everything and kind of remind people where we are and what we're doing. So EJUSA, we're a national group, and we're working to repeal the death penalty and to help communities think about what does it look like to respond to violence without centering punishment, police, and prisons. And my branch of EJUSA is called the Evangelical Network. And so I reach out to Christians and especially evangelicals about those things I said before, the death penalty, restorative justice. How can we think about doing public safety in a new way? And so each month we do this In the Movement webinar to talk about those things and to invite people into this space, both to hear and to ask questions. So Will and Mona and I are going to talk for 45 or 50 minutes. We'll save some time at the end to ask questions. So any of you are welcome to put a question, if you don't want to forget it, in the chat or in the Q&A feature, and we'll come back to that at the end and also see if anybody has any towards the end of our time. So Will is EJUSA's Director of Violence Reduction Initiatives. And there's a lot that goes under that title. And that title might not describe all that Will does, and he'll talk some more about that. And Mona is also with EJUSA and has been with the group for a long time. She might share some more about that, but she's the Director of Advocacy and Campaigns and is queen of a document called the Advocacy Matrix, which might come up. And it's a really helpful, complex, cool thing that we have. So our topic today is looking at and thinking about community-centered public safety ecosystems. And we'll repeat that phrase because it's becoming, in a way, a cornerstone of EJUSA, or an umbrella under which everything, even death penalty work, is under. So we'll talk about what community-centered public safety ecosystems are. We'll break the term down into those three pieces. What does it mean for something to be community-centered? What do we mean by public safety? What do we mean by ecosystems? And we'll also think about what role can Christians and Christian churches especially play in this ecosystem framework that we're talking about. So I want to give some statistics that help give a sense of a lot of things that we know, but here is how our criminal legal system functions, its size and scope, and then we're going to jump right into asking Will and Mona, how do we respond to this, and how our CCPSEs is still long to say. I don't know if I'll use the acronym or not. Is that the answer, and why and how has EJUSA settled into that being our lane? So in the United States, we have almost 1 million police officers. There's over 2 million people incarcerated, which is 1 out of every 100 individuals. There's 2,300 jails and prisons, about 2,400 people on death row. I believe there's 28 remaining executions scheduled just for this year. Over half of violent crimes that happen within our country go unreported. Or put another way, the majority of people who experience violence are choosing nothing rather than engaging our criminal legal system. We in America have the highest rate of incarceration of anyone in the world. We have 1/3 of the world's female prisoners. And so all of these show the size, scope, and scale, and just reveal, here's how in America we respond to violence. If our criminal legal system worked, if punishment worked within our country, it'd be the safest country in the history of the world. And obviously we know it's not. So we've got to think of other ways of how can we respond to violence and harm. And that's part of what EJUSA is doing, not necessarily reforming the system that we have, but how can we build something entirely new that doesn't center those things of punishment, police, and prisons. And so Mona, can you start and talk about the disparity of we invest in our criminal legal system as a whole right now, and how that compares or doesn't to how we invest in supporting communities?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Sam. Hello, everyone. I'm super excited to have this conversation with my colleagues today. I've been thinking about these statistics over the weekend since we since, we talked about how we were going to start. And I think I just want to note that globally, when we look at budgets, our federal budgets, our state budgets, our county budgets, our city budgets, the amount of money that is spent on prisons and punishment is so much larger than the amount of money that we spend on protecting our neighborhoods. And, I think as we're going to get into, hold on.
Mona lives in San Francisco and sometimes has loud things going by her house. And I'm guessing maybe that's what it is.
It's true. The fire department is out. I think, we know that the drivers of violence are not arrested or impacted by punishment, that it's the drivers of violence that we need to impact on the front end. And I think we'll talk about things that lead us towards violence. And what we know is that punishment and over policing and mass incarceration don't actually end violence. And so I think what I would encourage folks to do is to take a look at your local budgets, your city budget, your state budget, and see how much money is spent on policing and defense and prisons versus supporting the needs of our communities. And I think, you'll start to see that our budgets are weighted towards punishment, and mass incarceration. And, we talk a lot about how budgets are a reflection of our values in our communities. And, I think it's so critical for us to start shifting how we value our communities, not just in policy, but inside our state budgets. And I think that is one huge way for us to start shifting the investment, and the way in which we protect our communities is by shifting how our budgets are weighted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, budgets both reflect what you value, but it also helps to shape it. I think about here in Charlottesville, an example I think of, Mona, what you're talking about is our community has a regional jail. It's our city, Charlottesville, and 2 surrounding counties. We share it with them. It's been under capacity for the last several years, and yet we're considering as a community a $49 million investment in a renovation. That won't increase bed capacity, but will make what is a wretched place, I've been there several times, better. And so our community is at that crossroads of thinking, do we want to make this jail a better place and invest in that? Or do we want to do something else? Do we want to try to take those funds and invest them within the community? And some are having a lot of difficulty about thinking about, well, humans are in this horrible condition, and even if I don't want this jail to grow still, but yet we have these other programs of violence interrupters on the street, of a restorative justice program that are doing some of this work that we're going to be talking about. It seems small, but it's a huge step, thinking about the budget and shifting those funds, or I've heard us use language of driving dollars to the ground. So, Will, what does this look like, especially when we consider Black and Brown communities? Why are those individuals and groups especially important to consider, both with those who are affected by it and both those communities that we need at the seat of power for this?
Absolutely. Thank you, Sam. It's great to be with both you and Mona today to have this conversation. I think about all the work that has been done, and coming off the heels of celebrating Dr. King yesterday, right? How much more work we have to do. And Mona, you talked about those budgets, and sometimes we attribute this quote that, budgets are moral documents to Dr. King, right? And I think it's absolutely true. Like when we look at our budgets around our country, it really tells us where our heart is, right? What we're actually investing in, what really matters to us. So I couldn't agree with you more around the ideas of just really understanding like how we're actually investing into our communities. But to get to your question, Sam, right? I think it's just important to note that when we look at the way our country has been grounded really in kind of inequitable white supremacist culture, what we see that no system has kind of walked away unscathed, right? And that is very true for our criminal legal system, or our systems that really look at building healing and safety within community. Over the past, I would say probably about 10 years, when we look at gun violence in our country, more than half of gun violence that happens in roughly like 150 different cities, right? And then when you drill down in those cities, they're happening in specific neighborhoods. And when you look at those neighborhoods, right, they're Black and brown communities, traditionally underserved, marginalized communities that haven't been engaged in conversations, community where we've invested in policing, but we haven't invested in healing. It's important to note that because, I mean, when the grand scheme of things, we know that, you know, if you're a young Black person, you experienced, right, the highest rates of violence in the United States. Black Americans, right, they face death by gun violence 10 times greater than their white counterparts. And so I think there are so many like data points that we can point to, right, that shows how much of an issue gun violence or violence is within community. But it's also important that we look at the other end as well, right? That healing actually happens in these communities as well. And so although the violence happens, there are communities around our country that have begun to invest in new strategies, right? In those new systems that you talked about, these community-centered public safety ecosystems, Sam. And so I'm excited to get into today's conversation because it really gives us an opportunity to explore the other side. We get the opportunity to explore what the solutions actually are. We know the old way isn't working. Right? We know that policing and prisons are not getting us this idea of safety that we all want to land on. So what is it? What actually brings us safety? And I'm hoping in today's conversation, we get to drill down a little bit into understanding not what just makes us safe, but how do we begin to invest in these strategies to build these ecosystems that ultimately get us to this point of safety?
Yeah, great. I'm so glad that we're both talking about the tragedy in certain communities, but also what they have to offer. And both of those things need to be part of the conversation. Mona, you talked earlier about some of the drivers of violence, and often we say we know what drives violence. Can you talk about that, but also under this heading of just why in America do we imprison so many people? It's exceptional what we do, and how's that connected to what actually drives violence?
Yes. I'll do my best to start on very large question. I think what we know about the drivers of violence, things like isolation, exposure to violence, folks who have been harmed, untreated trauma, and really at the end of the day, it boils down to, folks don't have an opportunity to heal from their trauma. And those are the things that lead to driving violence. And so when you put that next to this question about why does America imprison so many people, I think it's a complex answer. Many of us have read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow and have see the trajectory of mass incarceration and imprisonment in this country as being, fully connected to the institution of slavery in this country, and as another way in which this country, really tries to hold control of Black and brown people. And I think a lot of folks like to say, and I think we believe, that the system is working exactly how it's supposed to work, which is to keep that control and to make sure that as many folks are housed in prisons as possible. And, I think at the same time, there is a really large reliance in the belief that, justice is punishment. And so I think because there is this large belief that justice is punishment, that road leads directly to imprisonment. And I think one of the things that I think we're going to talk through today is, how do we as EJUSA want to unpack this idea of justice and really reframe it, so that what happens, so when we think about justice, it actually is people-centered and focused on healing and safety. But I think, Will, I'd love to hear if you have any additions, because this question of why do we imprison so much is very huge, and I certainly am not the only one who can answer it.
Sure. It is a huge question. You're absolutely right, Mona. And we can probably do a whole webinar, Sam, just on this question, right? How do we get here? But I think for so long, right, we've equated this idea of safety in a way that has kind of separated us as community, right? Separated us as a country. that for some folks to be safe, some people need to be removed. And what we found is that idea isn't true, right? Removing people from communities, separating people doesn't necessarily bring safety. In fact, that we know it actually harms community more. And so when we begin to rethink safety, then it allows us to really reflect back on, wow, this idea of justice, this criminal legal system or criminal justice system isn't necessarily getting us to where we want to go. And so I think we can talk about, right, how we got to this place. We can talk about the roots of harm and trauma in our country. And I think when you look at that route, right, we totally understand why we are where we are today. But what's exciting is that there is an alternative, right? We know now, like, what actually makes people feel safe. It's not, right, separation. It's actually feeling whole, feeling that you're a part of a community, that people care for you, that have access to opportunities for you, your family. And so it's important for, I think, this conversation for us to ground ourselves in that space, right? Because we know the justice system isn't actually bringing us justice. It isn't bringing us safety. It isn't bringing us healing. It isn't bringing us accountability, right? So we need to think about what does bring those things to our communities. What makes us feel whole? What makes us feel safe, right? What allows us to heal? What holds ourselves, our communities accountable when harm does happen? And so I understand how we get to where we are, but we are at a point now, I think, in our country with the investment, with the awareness, with the organizing that's happening to actually get to a place where we're developing something different than police and prisons, right? Where we're developing community wellness, where we're developing communities that are coming together to create solutions, to bring wholeness to neighborhoods and spaces that are actually seeing themselves as communities, right? As neighbors, as members of this broader kind of society that are working together within this kind of ecosystem frame, which I know we'll get to in a little bit, to actually be one together, right? Because it's all of us together that actually bring this idea of safety to fruition.
Yeah, I think the other piece of this work, and Will, what you're talking just made me think about this, is this clear recognition that imprisonment is a form of violence, and what it does not do is lead to healing. And so, our executive director talks about this often, and she, with her experience as being a former prosecutor, has talked about, she never saw a case of someone who hadn't had trauma early in their lives. And, what happens is, we take people who have been traumatized and, have committed harm, and then we put them into a place that continues to further traumatize them and inflict more violence. And then, they're released out into, a community with zero support and having been further traumatized. And it's just like continuing to the cycle of violence over and over and over again. And so this recognition that this idea of punishment is more traumatizing and only adds violence into the situation, I think is a critical piece for all of us to understand as we move forward to try to really transform how we impact harm.
It's a big turn for people to think of the system itself as an agent of violence, which it is. And it's critical that we think that. And you all both talked about the separation or the isolation that the system does, with the assumption that that helps. And unfortunately, it's important for people to remember that Christians were the idea that brought prisons to the United States as a reform effort. It was in the late 1700s. It was in Philadelphia. And the idea was, let's stop torturing people and let's put people in these cells, model it off of a monastery, which is why it was called a penitentiary, so that it would provoke penitence and people would come to repentance. And we know that that kind of forced isolation not only doesn't bring about repentance, but it adds further trauma and it continues that cycle of violence. And I'm glad you used that phrase, Mona, because we've talked about, and we talk often about, what does it look like to break that cycle of violence? I think about Jesus talking about turn the other cheek. And sometimes that's misinterpreted as just complete non-engagement and pacifism. But what that's getting at is choosing to end the cycle of violence. It doesn't mean not act. In the Psalms, it talks about breaking the arm of the wicked, right? Christians are meant to engage and act justly in love and mercy. But that idea of turning the other cheek means you aren't yourself, as an individual or a group or an institution, keeping that cycle of violence going. But none of this is neutral. If we all just keep it as is and don't engage, it will self-perpetuate. So it's not just think, oh, am I actively supporting it? It's, am I actively working against it and for something else? Because if not, then we've got to. So let's jump in. Oh, and I want to say this, because you all talked about the healing being so important, but yet there being trauma. I think about another partner of ours, Al Tariq in New York, and how he has said, hurt people, but healed people heal people. And often those are the same individuals. Often someone who's able to heal can do that from trauma. And recognizing the trauma in someone who's brought harm doesn't excuse what they've done, but it really helps explain it. And it helps people see the mutual trauma, but also that not being the only thing of what makes somebody somebody.
Yes.
And oh, go ahead, Will.
Now I was going to say, Sam, just thank you for bringing that up, right? Because I mean, when you look at the data, I want to say it's like 9 out of 10 folks that have committed some type of harm identify as folks that have been harmed themselves, right? Where that harm has been unaddressed, where that trauma has been unaddressed. So understanding the cyclical nature of violence and harm is critical to this idea of understanding how we build safety, how we build healing within community. And I love Al Tariq's quote. Right. And it just makes so much sense, right? If hurt people, heal people can heal people. And I think we need to focus on that latter part more and more and more, because at some point, right, healing becomes this kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Exponential or like fractal idea, right? When one person begins to heal, like they heal, but they also begin to do that healing in their family, and they do that healing within the community, and it just grows and grows and grows. So focusing on that healing component is just critically important.
Yeah, fractal is a good description, and you win the award for best word in the webinar so far. Yeah, that's great. I think that captures it.
We've got 40 minutes to go. I think there'll be some other words coming out.
But like Will says, like the example of somebody else healing almost gives agency to somebody else to see that it's possible and that it's something that you can do.
Right. I also want people to hear this, and then let's talk about community-centered public safety ecosystems, that our criminal legal system depends on fear. It perpetuates fear, but it also is completely built in a response to that. Our criminal legal system is built off of our fear of the other with a capital O, largely the black and brown other, but any other. It depends on creating a certain category of people to maintain things. You all already talked about the isolation and removal from society. And even when someone's released from the system, they are still within its shadow. There's that civic death that happens as someone who's formerly incarcerated goes back into the world. There's still that connection. There's still that ripple effect of what it's doing. But our system relies on fear. And that's one of the simplest turns someone can have when we think about it is, rather than continuing the cycle of violence and when harm happens, think, okay, how do I need to punish in response to it? If we just think through a lens of healing, we're starting to shift from a fear-based response toward one of love. And Will, you talked about Martin Luther King Jr. and yesterday being the day commemorating him. That's his entire framework and philosophy. How can we build this beloved community? And having that lens. If we ask that question, what does it look like to love my neighbor? I don't think anything that our system currently does would be happening. And especially for Christians, that's where we begin things. So I want to recognize and then reject how our system creates a category of person, someone that we need to marginalize, remove. My safety depends on the removal and entombment of someone else. And then I want to say this quote from author Lee Griffith. He talks about how there's such an overlap in scripture of prisons with just terrible things, but he puts it this way. He says, cages, chains, pits, dungeons, jails, and prisons are biblically identified with the power and spirit of death. They are totally and irrecoverably renounced. Anytime you have those things like a prison mentioned in scripture, it's always negative. It's always someone wanting to be released from that. So again, I think about what Jesus said when he came and spoke to the crowd and talked about Isaiah. He came to set the prisoners free. There's a spiritual element of that, but I also believe that that is a literal release of those who are in prison. Maybe not automatic, maybe not without certain condition, but there is this release and this reintegration, and love is meant to be that frame. So we think we have some of what that looks like, right? This community, we've seen examples of this, and you two have termed it So if you had to define what is a community-centered public safety ecosystem, just in a sentence or two, because I think people will get a feel over the next 30 minutes of what these look like and what they are. But if you had to really nail down a sentence or two of this is what it is at its core, what would either or both of you say?
I mean, I guess I'll chime in first, Mona. I think a community-based public safety ecosystem is an ecosystem, a group of intervention strategies, community that have come together to really center those that have been most harmed in the developments of solutions in creating safety and healing within communities. I think at its core, that's what it is. And I know we'll get in a little bit deeper, right, around like what the different points of the ecosystem are, but in a nutshell, right, it's communities coming together to build safety and healing that really centers and lifts up and acknowledges the role of those that have been most harmed within the community.
Yes, I think the only thing I would add is that one of the things that's so beautiful about the ecosystem frame is that it's an acknowledgement of the complexity, and that the work moving forward is interconnected, and it requires us to work together and, you know, in collaboration. And I think that's why we like to use the word ecosystem, because it is it's not just one thing that is going to move us to where we're trying to go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Part of what drew me to this idea, I mean, in a sense, I've seen this done across the country, and we work with groups doing this. And then we kind of look back and we're like, wow, there's a pattern here. There are things that are the same here. Now let's kind of put this under an umbrella. But one piece that's core for me is that community-centered public safety ecosystems hold that incarceration should not be our only and absolutely isn't our best response to violence, that there are other options. And as you all have alluded to already, we're not just saying one thing. And that's the beauty of this. It's going to be specific or particularized or contextualized for each community. They can think through what is it that we need for safety. Now, there's some common factors that will be there, but it gives the power to a community to come together and think, here's what safety can look like for us. Here's the talent that's already here. And here's how we as a community can tap into that. So what's the origin of this term? Kind of where did that come from, and how did that blossom out of wherever it came from?
You want to start, Will, or you want me to start?
You
I
can
don't
go
know.
ahead and start.
I
Go
don't
ahead.
know the answer. Oh gosh, I think one, it's again, as it's a recognition of our trying to find something that describes a complex system that works together to create one community. And so I think all of us learned about ecosystems when we were in most of us learned about ecosystems when we were in school, even elementary school. We've done some ecosystem, we built some terrariums as an example of ecosystem. I think for us, it started to really, you know, come together in a way that it was a one word to explain like a complex set of things working together. And I feel like it's been a while since we've been starting to talk about the word ecosystem, but it feels like it's been a very kind of organic blossoming of the word. But Will, please add your own.
No, absolutely. So I knew this question was coming, Sam, right? And I've been thinking about it. And, you know, I think it's hard to actually name where the naming came from, right? But what I don't think is difficult is to point to the communities that have been operating within the ecosystem frame for generations, right? And so we can say the term community-based public safety ecosystem and what is that formally, but we've seen, you know, these types of strategies as like elements of survival for Black, brown, marginalized communities throughout our country's history, right? And I think what we're seeing now is a more formal language, right? A more formal investment to actually make bolster these strategies up, right? Bring them to the forefront as the way that we actually bring safety to community. So I just want to acknowledge like this work at some level has been happening within
Mhm.
communities. Communities have had their own ecosystems for ages, right? Not just in this country, but for the entire kind of history of our world, right? These ecosystems have been thriving. And I
Mhm.
think what we're seeing now is this idea of safety being reframed, and the responsibility and the accountability that's attached to safety kind of be repositioned, right? There's a kind of used it like a pole shift happening, right? I think for a long time, these ideas of safety, these strategies all rested within the domain of law enforcement and police. But what folks are beginning to see now is that shift, right? And that shift is that ecosystem, right? The development of the ecosystem where we're actually shifting the responsibility, right? The kind of power within the ecosystem frame to community. So community is actually at the center.
Mhm.
And what
Mhm.
we're seeing now is kind of the connective tissue kind of begin to grow out with all these other services, interventions that have always existed in community, but for a lot of time, they've existed in isolation, right? And so I
Yeah.
think it's important to know when we start talking about the ecosystem, and Mona, I think you may have said this, that the ecosystem, for it to thrive, it relies on all the different members of the ecosystem, right? There's this kind of idea of balance that exists. And the balance has been askew for a long time, Sam, right? And what we're seeing now in communities like Newark, communities like Baton Rouge, but all over the country, is the fact that once we're restoring that balance, it requires a new investment, right? A new kind of shift in where the power lies in safety. And so I think about a place like Newark, New Jersey, right? Mona, I think I was talking to you a few months ago, maybe now, and I'm like, we were partnering with the Newark Community Street Team. I've been co-facilitating the Newark Public Safety Roundtable, which is a space that the street team developed. And I was like, like 6 years ago, we were talking about this ecosystem thing. Like, it just came up. So I want to point back to the roundtable when it was happening on Hawthorne Avenue in Newark, New Jersey, Sam, to say that's where the language blossomed out of.
Mhm.
But more than the language, I think Newark is just a prime example of the space where we saw the activities of the ecosystem flourish and develop, right? We saw community members really begin to engage in the idea of safety, the process of safety. We saw community-based interventions actually get off the ground and start actually doing the work of violence intervention and prevention. We saw hospitals say that, hey, we have a role in this too. And we saw municipal government acknowledge the fact that, hey, maybe the things that we've been doing for a long time aren't the things that we should be doing moving forward. And they began to invest and really support community-based and community-led strategies around safety and reducing violence in community.
Mhm.
So I may be jumping the gun here, right? Naming some of these elements, but I think it's important for us to begin to do that naming so folks understand what the ecosystem actually looks like.
Right. Right. And that this term is not inventing something and then going and creating it. This is a label for something that's been ongoing, that we want to deepen and further and replicate and all of that. But yet this has been ongoing. I want to call people's attention to something I'm going to share and show you on the screen. And if you're just listening and not watching, either way, I'll put this link in the email where I send it out after. But it's a page on EJUSA's site, and I'll let you all look at it more on your own when I email you the recording of this and some links. But it's how we talk about what justice is. And how we think about typically that narrative is that justice and punishment are synonymous. And we want to break that narrative because we know that that doesn't work. We know that our system doesn't bring what it promises of healing, safety, and accountability. But I especially want to draw people down towards this framework here about how trauma connects individuals and how when we have harm, there's three parties or groups to really consider. There's the person who was harmed, the person who did the harm, and then the surrounding community. And whether we acknowledge it or not, these three groups are always interconnected. Our system works really hard to separate and isolate and put in opposition these groups to each other. But if we're talking about what true safety, healing, and accountability looks like, it puts these three groups in conversation. One, just logically, to me, that works. Two, we've seen it work and we can give examples of it. But third, that so aligns with how Christian theology talks about both sin and healing. Theologically, sin is always something that's communal. When harm or violence happen, it's always something that doesn't just affect an individual, it's always those around them. And if that's true, then healing is the same as well. If harm affects a community, then healing is required. And not just a community is obligated then to pursue that healing. And so all that we're saying presupposes an interconnectedness of different groups that's necessary, not just for the person who was harmed, but for the person who did the harm as well. We want to see their good and their growth. Okay, let's go. Or Moni, I saw you come off mute. Do you want to jump in?
I feel like I think I see the question in the chat about looking for some examples to alternatives to incarceration. And one of the things that I think about a lot is I feel like we're in this almost like a generational cramp of as we move towards this shift, because I think it's this idea of building safety through community-centered ecosystems is also, one way in which we start, impacting violence from the front end. And so as we build systems, then we should start seeing violence decreasing and an increase in how communities are able to work together. And so I think about this for myself a lot, in that it's almost, given how big and monstrous our system of incarceration is, it's almost hard to think about what is possible when we start shifting the balance of violence in our communities. And I know that's not a specific answer to your question about alternatives to incarceration. And I think like we're in a place where right now we're still trying to figure out like, what are those alternatives to incarceration? And I think there are communities are exploring with a lot of different kinds of strategies. There are restorative justice strategies, like local, drug courts, or sort of drug compatibility, accountability, more supportive housing. But I think that is still a place where I think we have a lot of work to do to figure out what is an alternative to incarceration. But I think that the answer to that question is going to shift as we start seeing violence going down.
Right. Right. Yeah. And we're talking about all points of this, right? Like we want to divert people from being incarcerated towards something else that is more holistic and healing. We also, at the end of things, as people come out of the system and re-enter, we want that to be, those individuals to be engaged and reintegrated as well. So we both want to respond to violence, but we also want to prevent it. And I think you're right. As we work to build this space of healing and interconnectedness, that violence is going to increase. But imagining what that is and what it looks like is incredibly difficult. So let's break the term down into three pieces: if community-centered, public safety, and ecosystem. And let's say a bit about why each of those is really important. Why is it important to center community, or what does it mean for something to be community-centered? Will, why don't you start with that?
Sure. I mean, I think this is probably the most easy one to kind of lay out, right? Community-centered, having community at the center of all the strategies that are being developed, all the conversations that are having, the policies that are being developed. And I think, we've said this, right? Community engagement, we're going to engage community, but I think it's a step further, right? It's an authentic engagement. It's an engagement and some, right? How are we centering the voices of those that have been most impacted by the harm that systems have caused already? I think I mentioned earlier, right? Those that have been closest to the harm need to be closest to the solutions. And it's important as we think about how we center community, it is one at every point of development to implementation, right? That cycle, right? To rethinking, back to development, and then implementation. But also how are community actually leading these strategies, right? Where it's not just a mayor, right? Where it's not just a police chief, right? Where it's not just the head of a hospital, but how are actual community members, right? Now honored to be able to actually take the reins of these strategies, right? And I think it's also important when we start talking about community-centered that we, for a long time, in the way we've centered law enforcement or government, has always come with a budget, right? And so as we think about recentering community and honoring community, that we need to invest in community the same way, right? So it's not enough to just say, hey, we want to center community, but we also need to give community the tools that they need to actually do the things that and implement the strategies that they actually develop on the ground.
Yeah, and I think the idea also is that this is like a telescoping term, in that, you know, when we want to center the folks who are most impacted, that starts at the block level, because like the folks who are most impacted on my block might be different than the folks who are most impacted on Will's block. And it also, I think, opens the space, and I know we're going to get to this, in that, you know, churches are on our blocks, all around our blocks, and as a church, in part of a community, in the block, in a series of blocks, you know, it's like a central place to start to learn and understand what do those folks in your neighborhood need the most. And I think we can telescope that all the way up to the federal level, and how, you know, those big budget bills are being made, billions of dollars moved to the ground. Like, you know, folks who are on our blocks doing that work should also, we also need to make sure that they are at those tables at the federal level, being part of what that solution is.
Sam, if I can, just really quickly too, and I would love for you to really lay this out, because I've heard you do it so well in this kind of theological context, right? Just around community, right? And folks seeing each other as community. Because when I look out across my street, some folks might not see folks that are houseless, right, as part of their community, but they are part of the community. So can you just like maybe really quickly and just do it for me, just lay out this idea?
I think of two things. I mean, it's what you were talking about first is not just an obligatory, someone from the community comes and speaks at a city council meeting, or someone gets a 5-minute spot at the town hall, right? This is complete integration. This is community, not just being invited to the table of power because, you know, we just kind of want you around. They are helping drive those decisions. Right now we have government or system centered things coming down from a small group of people, typically white, and then impacting communities. What we're saying is, no, those communities are there and deciding and given that power to help decide. And yeah, Christianity gives a really unique lens of communities. I mean, communities and who your neighbor is, Christianity gives a unique answer to. I mean, when Jesus was asked, who is my neighbor? He gave the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? So an individual was robbed and beaten on the side of the road, and 2 individuals came by and passed this person, but then a Samaritan, an enemy of the Israelites, came and yet helped this person. And so part of what that's saying of who my neighbor is, it's not just who I'm living around. It is those that I'm living around and I'm working with and seeing, but it's also those that I encounter who have need. And so in order to really know what my community is, yes, it's those that are living around me, but it's also those that I encounter who have a need. And so a neighbor for a Christian, really for anyone, but especially as a Christian, because we're called to love and live out in the world, is someone who is around you and someone who has a need. And then for Christians, there's this duty and delight of then being called to go and to help meet that need. That requires that you see that person, that you think of that person as interconnected with you, that you see that need, come under and then beside that person to work and help meet it. So the idea of what is a neighbor, who is a neighbor or a community for a Christian is broader and deeper and more difficult, but yet more fulfilling and more impactful than anything else. Okay, what then is public safety, kind of the middle piece of that term? How is this calling us to think about safety in a different way as a country or as communities? Mona, can you talk about that?
Sure. So, you know, Will and I talk to a lot of folks, and, you know, one of the questions we ask a lot is, what is safety? You know, and so we've had the opportunity to hear from many people around that who we've talked to in an answer to this question. And the thing that stands out the most, and we get all kinds of answers, but the thing that we hear the least is the presence of police, which tells us a lot about what safety means to people and how people feel safe in their own communities. And so again, I think this goes to the idea, you know, Will talked earlier about how, you know, police and government have been centered so often, and in our budgets, in our policies, in an effort to keep us safe. And what we know is that the centering of police isn't what helps people feel safe. People want to feel safe walking on the streets at all at all times of the day, people, want to feel that, they have access to food and clean water, and that have an opportunity to be healed, and that their neighbors have an opportunity to be healed.
Mhm.
And so I think for us, the idea is that, safety isn't just about being policed, that it's like so much more than being policed.
Mhm.
And so that is why we want to talk about, centering the needs of our communities inside this ecosystem, because it isn't just the needs of our police officers or our government.
Mhm. And pursuing the safety is not easy, right? You mentioned restorative justice earlier. If we're putting in a room together someone who's done harm and someone who's been harmed, there's a degree that that is unsafe. Right now, we're not wanting to perpetuate harm, and we're certainly not wanting to exact punishment. But if someone is thinking I can pursue safety in this way we're talking about without things being uncomfortable or things being difficult, well, we're not saying that too. We're not talking about avoiding discomfort. In fact, we might be talking about an intentional engagement with discomfort for the sake of the other. So safety doesn't mean I'm not uncomfortable, but we do want to talk about maybe a difference of hurt versus harm. We might experience some further hurt in this, and it's difficult, yet we're wanting to break that cycle of violence and that cycle of harm. I also think about in C.S. Lewis's series, The Chronicles of Narnia, there's a piece there where some of the characters are talking about Aslan the lion, one of the main characters, who's meant to represent God in that series. And someone asks about Aslan, oh, well, he's safe, right? And one of the characters replies, oh, no, he's not safe, but he's good. And they're getting at the idea that if we're actually going to pursue something that's good and healing and centered on love, there's a degree that that's not fully safe, because it's going to change our lives. It could make things difficult. It's going to require of us to invest and sacrifice for each other. And while it might not be safe in that sense, it is great and it is good. And I
Yeah.
hear, Mona, what you're saying, that's in such contrast to the way that we normally think about what keeps me safe: punishment, police, and prisons.
Yeah, I think it requires us to see each other, all of each other, and to hold one another with love, right? It's so, so much of the work that we do, like, justice is love out loud. And the way in which we move towards justice is by loving our communities around us. And one other thing I think about in terms of public safety, is, Will and I, we talk a lot about advocacy and policy, and, this idea of safety and policy, like there is for us, I think it's a call as we talk to our policymakers around helping policymakers understand that public safety isn't just police and prisons. And it's a requirement to us as we talk to policymakers to make sure to continue to, one, as we talked about earlier, bring our impacted communities to the table, and to continue, really talking to our policymakers about what public safety is in the full breadth of that sense. And so that's some of our policy work is so much about talking to policymakers about what else could we do? What else do we need to set up systems, right? Systems inside systems, like system strategies that can hold the place for the community to be part of that public safety conversation and the work.
Let's think about that third piece of ecosystem and why that word has been intentional. You've already alluded to it a little bit. And we've talked about how ecosystems, I'm thinking like sixth grade ecology, right? And an ecosystem, I think about like a jungle and how it's so, one, interconnected. One piece depends on another piece. One piece cannot exist or thrive without it affecting someone else. And then the reverse is true, right? If one piece is missing or does harm, it ripples out and affects everybody around it. And I've also heard you say, I think today, about an ecosystem, it needs to be complex. It's not one thing of a few decisions coming down from a few people top down. It is really complex what we want to build. And in some ways, this might be more difficult because it's going to require more of us. But say some more about why that term ecosystem, that is a sciencey term, fits here and how we're talking about living life together.
I'll jump in quickly, Sam. I think you just laid it out beautifully, right? I don't know if there is much more to say about the ecosystem frame, right? It's really about a system or a set of interventions that are really working together in this kind of symbiotic kind of movement, in this flow that really builds off of each other, right? One part strengthens the other part. And I think what I pulled out that really resonated with me when you just talked about the ecosystem is the way that when one part of the ecosystem begins to fail, how that has that ripple effect out in the rest of the ecosystem, right? But what I think is powerful is when you have a thriving ecosystem, there are these little indicators that you can see, right? When things don't go right and folks can kind of come together and build solutions or strategies. I think the pandemic is like a place where we saw a community-based public safety ecosystem really begin to meet the needs of community. Right? When folks were shut in, right? When folks couldn't come outside, the ecosystem, right? Those folks that are in these communities begin to see, well, our neighbors on this street, right, are of a certain age. They're not coming out the house, but we know food insecurity exists there, right? How are we leveraging our community-based violence intervention and preventionists, right, to now step up as healthcare workers, right? Where they can then be able to address some of the other needs that we know bring safety to communities. So, you know, they may show up on a whole block and make sure everybody has a meal, right? That everybody is getting access to healthcare. It's important that we, one, I think, acknowledge that when the ecosystem shows up, all of the things that are going wrong can be tackled, right? Solutions can be created. But as a part of this, I also just noted, right, the versatility of those community members that are working within the ecosystem, right? So we talked about the outreach workers, those frontline interventionists, right? They meet the need. They are first responders. And so I think there's this idea of adaptability, right? When a challenge is presented, those within the ecosystem can then begin to adapt and then address the concerns or the needs that may arise or exist within community.
I think what I would add is, this frame also, requires us to not act in silo, right? Not just folks on the ground and in community, but also our policymakers and our government, right? I think it's very easy, and we see it at all levels of government, for different departments to silo themselves out into their own expertise. And part of our work at a policy level is to continue to knit together the silos at that policy level, because I think we're seeing it happen at a community level with organizations, especially at the ground level. We're seeing the benefits when organizations are able to work together, because you can, someone can notice over here, just like you said, this thing is happening on this block. And let's get together and figure out what we can do to support that. Like, that flexibility happens on the ground, but there's much more rigidity the higher you go up the policy levels. And so when we talk about systemic solutions to support this work happening on the ground, those are the kinds of things that we need. How can we break that rigidity in a way that allows the work that's happening on the ground to go forward without delay? Because sometimes that is also that rigidity can sometimes lead to the delay on the ground.
Right. We're in our last 6 minutes or so. So if people have questions they want to ask, feel free to put those in the chat or in the Q&A. And so I want to move towards thinking, one, about what this looks like in church involvement. I mean, what an ecosystem looks like. You all have given some examples of this, right? We've talked about restorative justice programs. We've talked about violence intervention groups. We've talked about hospital violence intervention-based programs as well. Those are just 3 of many different solutions that are out there. People can Google or email us to hear more about those 3. And there's so much more than that, right? The answer is going to be complex. It's going to be particularized to a certain place. And Will, you also gave a nod to a city that's doing a lot of this, of Newark, New Jersey. And one thing I'll send out to everyone is a report that was compiled of looking at Newark as one of the premier trauma-informed cities and thinking about a lot of these things. And that's Will's city where he is right now. Will is helping lead a lot of those efforts of what does it look like for a city to do this well? And I don't know if we said this, but this has to be on purpose. This does not happen by accident. It takes years of intentional work to be able to do this. So as we move towards the end, Will and Mona, what are ways that churches especially can be helpful as you two are working in communities across the country? What are some things that an ideal church could do that would help further these things that we're talking about?
and we only have 4 minutes left, so I'm gonna try to be quick because this is a long list.
Yeah.
But I would point to a few things. First, listen to the need in community, right? Don't just dive in as like this body that has the solution,
Mhm.
right? I think that has happened a lot in communities all over the country where the church has said, okay, we're going to do this thing. And the thing was maybe not a coat drive, but it might have been like a food distribution that needed to happen, right? And so how do you see yourselves as a community member within the ecosystem and begin to build the relationships and begin to show up? Two, rely on and understand that, everybody has a lane in this conversation. And, creating a violence intervention organization might not be the lane of the church,
Mhm.
right? If folks are looking for spaces to come together, to have conversations, open the doors, right? Folks want to organize, folks want to build community together, but sometimes don't have a place to do it. And so many of our churches have some type of community space, a rec space, where you can invite folks in with open arms and then give them the space to have the conversations that need to happen, right? And understand that it doesn't need to always come from the front, right? Leadership shows up in the back too. So being able to just step back and let community take the lead and actually do the things and be okay with that, right? And figure out where you're needed, I think are some first steps. And then lastly, Sam, I'll point to an example down in Richmond, right? Having the conversations within your smaller church community, right? Begin to unpack some of these ideas and concepts around what is safety, what does community look like, what are we doing as community, and then what does that look like to become active within the community? Is there policy advocacy opportunities, right? Are there organizing opportunities that we can be a part of? We don't have to always do the programming. There are other parts that are core to the flourishing of these ecosystems within our communities.
Mhm. I think about love thy neighbor begins with knowing thy neighbor. Or we can go to Socrates. I saw someone put in the chat of know thyself. And in churches, this is real hard for churches, but one to kind of come under a community in a neighborhood. What is there? Can I have a posture first of learning and listening before I come in and try to take over?
As churches, I think churches in a lot of ways have a front row seat to the violence that's happening in your communities, and being able to sit in that place and support the healing, whether it's of parishioners or people in the community, is a really powerful way to support an ecosystem becoming vibrant. And I think everybody deserves an opportunity to heal. And as churches, you see people who suffer from violence regularly. So I think that's one way to start talking to your parishioners and understand however folks are willing to talk, what do folks need who have been impacted by violence right in your church. And that will probably lead to even a broader conversation with folks around the church in the neighborhood about what people need to heal from violence. And as Will said, you might not, it probably isn't to build a CVI organization, but churches have so many resources and so many ways to impact, as we talked about earlier, those drivers of violence, isolation, food insecurity, poverty, all of those ways in which we can help people be whole and feel whole in their space contributes to a thriving ecosystem, and it contributes to each person being healed.
Let me start to close us out as we move towards the end of our time. One, I'm going to put in the chat, and I'll send this to you all who've registered. I'll email this to you. It's our document that points towards, one, the theology that we've developed around some of these things, but also there's a church and justice tool that's there. And we've put together some videos, some ideas, and resources from about 24 other organizations to help churches do some of what I hear you two saying. How can I, in a way, do an assessment of my community of a church, the surrounding neighborhood around me, and then what do I do? It could be a long process, and it should be one that begins with prayer, but also really begins with listening and hearing from others and listening to those that are in your community, especially those who've been impacted by harm. And if those people aren't at your church, that's a good time to ask, well, why aren't those individuals here? Are there things about my community that might have excluded those who have experienced harm? If 1 out of every 100 individuals are within the system, we all should know someone. And as the church, especially, we should be engaging and loving and serving and working in solidarity with that group. So I'll send that to you. And this conversation needs to keep going of how churches can and should be involved, right? Churches can think creatively about this. There's not one answer, but I think it begins in prayer and it begins in listening. I think we've said those two things. So our next in the movement webinar is going to continue some of this and look at the history. I saw some of you in the chat ask questions about how we got here. So February 7th, it's a Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern is the next webinar. It's with Dr. Jason Sexton. He's going to come and help talk about what is the Christian church's relationship with prisons? What has it been over time? And what could or should it be now? We're doing that webinar in conjunction with CCDA, the Christian Community Development Association's Locked in Solidarity Week, the LIS week, where they work to equip churches to think about how to work against mass incarceration. And so that conversation is going to give the history of how we got here and what are some ways that we can start responding toward it. I'll send you all the Newark report that we talked about. That's a snapshot of a city doing a lot of this work. And I'll send you again the link I put in the chat that especially brings to your attention the Church and Justice tool that was written for churches to start to think about that question of what can we do in response to this? Because this is new. And this is different. It's not new in the sense of asking a church to see and love, but for us to not center the system as the people of God, that's really different, especially when we think about how integral Christians have been to construct the existing system. It's part of why I want to speak and reach out to Christians. I think we help build this problem, and I think out of love and duty, we're obligated to undo it and build something different and better. Will and Mona, thank you, friends, for coming and sharing. I have learned so much and appreciate your work and your time as friends and as colleagues and co-laborers in all of this. So thank you so much for coming and sharing with everybody here. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, friends, appreciate it so much. Thanks to everybody who's listening. I'll email soon with a recording of this, and hopefully we'll see you all next month. Blessings on the rest of your day. Bye-bye.